I've been reading the mail and fielding some rather frantic requests for clarification of Unit 2, so I thought what I'd better do is come in here and just walk through it again. I think when I write these things up that I'm being very clear, but obviously it doesn't always work that way. It's nice to get the feedback. So let's see if we can't clarify it. All right, the first week, that was last week, research and preparation for historical fiction. And what I've asked you to do is to read Young Goodman Brown and to do research into the period of Young Goodman Brown. Now, we know the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts in 1620. We also know that Nathaniel Hawthorne is writing his story in 1835, or at least publishing it about that year. And so what I've done is I've said, let this be our box. We'll start with 1620, we'll start with Massachusetts and the Puritans, and we'll go through 1835. Now, my thought was a lot has happened in that period of time. There's a tremendous amount of stuff that happens in that period of time. And the fact that it starts with Young Goodman Brown in Massachusetts and has to do with witches and demons and devils and all that kind of stuff doesn't mean that's where it has to stay, because so much changes. By the time Hawthorne is writing, Puritanism has spun out into such diverse things as Congregationalism and Unitarianism, with the Baptists somewhere in the middle of that. So you've got a religious thing that you can do going that way. But there's also colonies being colonized up and down the seaboard. Massachusetts is just one of them. When I wrote, look for anything, I kind of meant that, anything. It would have influenced Nathaniel Hawthorne's writing of the story, all right, but it might have been something else that influenced them altogether. Now, week 5, we're just now concluding week 5. What I'd ask you to do there is to write to the Hawthorne Historicism discussion. Focus on the historic backstory of Young Goodman Brown, and then working collaboratively with your classmates, look for the conflicts, debates, tensions, and other potential stories generating out of this period. Well, clearly we've got religion, but we've also got the Revolution. We've also got the French and Indian Wars. We've got the writing of the Declaration of Independence, then the Constitution. We are not quite to the point where we're getting into the abolition movement, but that's coming. And there's just a lot of stuff you could do. What I am seeing, and what kind of troubles me, is I'm seeing reports on the history of the Puritans in Massachusetts. That's the starting point. That's not all you're supposed to do. What you're supposed to do is look at that imaginatively and see where the story might be. Now, one of the things that I did in looking at this thing is I did research on Tituba. I call her Tituba, my wife calls her Tituba. I don't know which it is, but that's the dark slave who what's the proper word? Seduced the young girls of Salem into the acts of witchery, depending on which story you listen to. She's a real person. She was an Arawak Indian. As soon as I found that out, I said, what's an Arawak Indian? And I went and did research and found out that, she came from a tribe that Columbus found in Hispaniola when he first landed there. But this is a language group that is all across the northern coast of South America and down into Peru and in Brazil. And that made me think, well, okay, I've got Massachusetts, but now I'm all the way down into South America, and I really like Spanish stuff. I don't particularly like the Spaniards in this period of time, but I read Spanish. I love Spanish film. I started doing some research in that direction, and all of a sudden I'm connected to another book I'm writing. This one's on William Blake. I've had this one on hold for the past few months because I needed to get busy with this course and some other things. And what's happened now is all of a sudden I've discovered that John Stedman, very good friend of William Blake, was in Suriname on the north coast of South America dealing with an Arawak uprising. And suddenly I've got a very rich story that has nothing to do with Massachusetts anymore. Except that it does, because Tituba is up in Massachusetts. When she gets arrested for all of this, she very quickly turns state's evidence and gets some leniency because she turns in everybody in a hurry. But somehow she really irritated her master, Mr. Parris, Reverend Parris, and he refused to pay her bail and let her get out of jail. She spent over a year in jail before some unknown person paid her fines and bought her and her husband and then disappeared. Well, there's a story. What happened to Tituba? Where did she go? And all of a sudden in my imagination I'm saying, why? She went to Virginia and she ended up in Sweat Swamp, and all of a sudden I'm thinking she's got children and she's got descendants, and that's the descendants who end up enslaved by my ancestors, the Bethays of Sweat Swamp, North Carolina. Is this a story I really want to write? Well, it's a hell of a story. I put some stuff in the discussion forum about my ancestor, Devil John Bethay, who, when his father, Sweat Swamp, was tortured by a guy named Snowden, he got pretty mad, and a few years later he ended up catching Snowden, hanging him from a low branch and kicking in his knees so that he could properly hang from this low branch. Now I have the ending of a story. I know how a story would end. Snowden is captured, Sweat Swamp tortures him, and eventually strangles him to death for the torture of his parents. Okay, that's the end of the story. How did this story begin, and what had to happen in order to get Snowden hanging from that low branch? That's what I've got to work with now. So my job this next week is to, let's see, what is it? Based on your research into the historical conflicts of this period, identify a particular event and key characters that you find worthy of writing about. And the place to begin is with the ending of the story. So write a brief of the ending of your story to put into the writing journal. Now, the last thing I want is for you to write a brief about what happened to young Goodman Brown. Frankly, that's a boring story. I shouldn't say that. It's a classic of American literature, but I find it rather tedious. I really like what we do with stories now, as opposed to what Hawthorne was doing when he was inventing the story form. Hawthorne wrote a nice story, but if we put it into a modern film, it would last 2 hours, and before it was over we would be terrified of the witches and the Dark Knight and the things that go bump and all of that kind of stuff. So that's what I would like to do, is I would like to take something out of that and move it over into the swamps of North Carolina or Virginia. Well, it depends on which year. That's okay. One of the things I'm going to have to do clearly is go to northern North Carolina or southern Virginia, and I'm going to have to do the research. I'm going to have to see on the ground what it's like to be in those swamps, because frankly, I'm a Texas boy. I don't know anything about swamps. There's my job. Your job. Out of all of this period of time, isn't there something that you found interesting, some story out there that you could start with? That's what I want to hear about.